You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Societies send people off to war and ask them to commit acts of violence in their name for their cause. The act of killing another human being strikes at the moral core of our species. And we are one of the very few species that will actually kill another member of the same species. I've said species too much, but you get the point. I'm interested in how we prepare people to make ethical decisions in combat based on moral frameworks that are in keeping with the society they represent. Basically, how do we prepare soldiers to make the right call at the right time? Especially if this call involves taking another life. G'day listeners, it's your host with the most, Mick, and we are back for another episode of The Dead Prussian, and we're going to get into some pretty heavy topics today, and luckily I've found someone who can do the heavy lifting, the heavy intellectual lifting, rather than myself. Not that I'm not capable of it, I just don't do the mental workouts that my guest does. My guest today is Tom McDermott, DSOMA. He joined the British Army in 2001 before transferring to the Australian Army in 2015. He took part in the 2003 invasion of Iraq as a tank officer and has worked in both the UK Ministry of Defence and the European Union military headquarters in Brussels. Must have been a tough posting. He attended the Australian Command Staff College in 2011, gained an MA in Strategy and Policy, and was awarded the Governor-General's Prize as the best student. He has served 3 tours in Afghanistan, the last as Reconnaissance Force Commander for the UK's Desert Rats, for which he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. He holds fellowships at the Centre for Military Ethics, that's at King's College London for those who didn't know that, and the Australian Centre for the Study of Armed Conflict and Society, UNSW Canberra, just down the road from TDP Studios. He is presently undertaking doctoral research into the strategy of coalition operations in the Helmand province of Afghanistan. You can follow him on Twitter via @HelmandProject. But, listeners, most importantly, he is the ethics guru I have been looking for. Tom, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Hey, good evening, Mick. How are you?
I'm very good. Yourself?
Yeah, good. I'm going to start by apologising for not wearing a Dead Prussian t-shirt, which I understand I should be doing now that you've launched a branding line, a particularly good quality one.
Well, that's right. I mean, it is particularly good quality, and you can tell by the price because they are exorbitant fees. But for those people out there looking for Dead Prussian merchandise, you can't get it anywhere else, so I've kind of got you over a barrel. I'll forgive you this time, but you come back on the show again as a repeat guest, it's kind of going to have to be mandatory.
Understood.
Now, Tom, you have written about ethics in relation to military service, military culture, and war. Can you first tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got into this field?
Yeah, sure, Mick. So, as you mentioned earlier, I joined the British Army in 2001. It was an interesting time to join. We sat at Sandhurst in the cafes, and we watched the Twin Towers come down on September the 11th. And funnily enough, we were supposed to be in a lecture at the Defence Studies Department called Causes of War. But when we went up there, we were told by the lecturer to go down and watch TV as they felt it would probably be instructive to us. And so over the sort of next 15 years, I was part of that generation that served through the global war on terror, through Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think there were 3 experiences that really got me interested in studying and writing about military ethics. And what was interesting about them was that they had very different ethical connotations to each one. So about 18 months after we watched the Twin Towers come down, I found myself in Iraq, in Kuwait, invading Iraq. And it's what I've sort of described as ice bucket ethics. You went through this process that is thankfully very rare of going from being in a state of peace to a state of war with literally the crossing of a boundary and a signing of an executive order. So suddenly you found yourself in a place where there was no violence to being in a place where there was absolute violence. And so that was the sort of ice bucket experience of ethics. The second one then was going to Afghanistan in 2010 and fighting through drones and various other systems that allowed us to look from very long distances. And we found ourselves in sort of a case of ethical disassociation from what we were up to. And the third one then was ground commanding back in Afghanistan in 2013, 2014 for a period of time where I spent a lot of time surrounded by a persistent ethical situation of trying to apply violence, on a regular basis and saw those sort of drifts that you find if you spend a lot of time in combat. So those three things got me very much into thinking about and reflecting about ethics. And I was very lucky on return to go and work at the British Staff College, which is a fantastic melting pot. And I met two very influential people for me, a guy called Steve Hart and a guy called Dr. David Wetton, who runs the King's College London Centre for Military Ethics. And on the back of that, we spent about 3 years writing and discussing the experiences that we had over the previous 15 years. And so that's kind of how I got into it.
It's almost as if a practical and theoretical experiences came crashing together. I like the analogy of the ice bucket experience, although, listeners, this is very different from the ice bucket challenge that has been around on social media. So please do not film yourself crossing the border into Iraq and posting it on social media. It is not what we are talking about. Now, your occasional paper, Soldiers, Squadrons and Strategists, the alliteration in the title is beautiful, by the way. As an English grad, I do appreciate anyone who can make me think of the bard. Discusses the role of military ethics and how it plays or should play for modern soldiers. Can you give a quick summary of the paper?
Yeah, sure. So the paper that has gone around recently was a paper that was written on the back of a conference in Canberra by a group of military ethicists. So a load of ethical directors of ethical centres in universities, but mostly Western, but including Hong Kong, had got together. And they asked me as a practitioner who thinks about this a fair amount to go down and speak to them about my view of the current state of play of ethics in Western armies and my reflections on the previous years. And so with the paper, I didn't feel I could talk about the future without talking about the past first. So I felt I had to reflect on the 15 years that we just done. And sadly, and you'll say, I think, we'll talk later about how this is not a particularly rosy picture. It isn't a very rosy one. And I think you'd find it difficult to find anyone who put in a strong argument that the previous 15 years in Iraq and Afghanistan particularly have been overly successful. We're talking $4 to $6 trillion worth of expenditure on the US side. We're talking 10,000 or over 10,000 coalition deaths, tens of thousands of deaths of Iraqis and Afghans. And we're still within a long war that is perhaps without end. So what I wanted to write about was the concerns that I had about how the global war on terror had changed or developed our relationship in Western societies with warfare. And that came out in a number of ways. How I felt that it had essentially broken down the societal trust that we'd had in the use of force. The lack of a success in Iraq and Afghanistan, having made the decisions to go and do them as societies, that fundamentally sort of degrades our capacity to trust our governments for the use of force. I wanted to think about the way that we've become increasingly remote, technically remote, using drone strikes. That drive-through of that technology wouldn't have happened if we hadn't gone into Iraq and Afghanistan, I don't think. Very much because we've started to use these tools that we now have across international borders on a very regular basis, with very little impact on ourselves. We're really starting to degrade, I think, that international system that we've relied upon for a long time. I bring up that David Kilcullen, when he was writing in The Accidental Guerrilla, he talks about the fact that the real threat of terrorism isn't this existential threat of terrorism. It's the way terrorism has made us change our own views. It almost made us cease to be ourselves. And so the paper was trying to address that and trying to say how, the global war on terror became so all-consuming to us that we had to consider, how do we go somewhere from that? Where do we go next in terms of our ethical relationship with the use of force in the military? Because it seems very clear that the modern battlefield is very much more about perceptions. We no longer seem to fight for strategic ends in terms of capturing hills, etc. It's about these perception things. And Colin Gray is very clear. He talks about the fact that ethics are a survival necessity and not a luxury. And I wanted to be able to propose as to how ethicists might help us as we reflect on that last 15 years. So that's where the paper kind of came from, and that's what it sought to do.
I actually read the paper, which is good. Very, very busy, but I took the time to read it, mainly because I've recently participated in some ethics workshops, and it actually made me look smart by quoting your paper. I may or may not have referenced them as your ideas. Now, I found the section on culture and a military identity crisis particularly interesting. It links to that society identity crisis you talked about that Kilcullen mentions within The Accidental Guerrilla. Can you explain what you mean by this culture and identity crisis within the military? Yeah,
so what I try and address there is the fact that what I believe is that some of the enduring impacts of the global war on terror on our militaries is relatively overt. So if you go and immerse yourself in the American military, the British military, the Australian military, you see the traits of those operations very deeply ingrained, right down to the tactics that we use, the language that we use, the uniforms that we wear, the equipment that we now have, that is all, particularly for smaller armies, very specific to those theatres. So if you go and look at the British military, there was a thing called Operation Entirety, where the British military essentially reorientated itself to win in Afghanistan. And the products of that, in terms of vehicles and equipment, it remains with us enduring because there is no money to buy new ones. So that's the overt impact of the global war on terror. But the research that I did to this also suggests that there are a number of deeper and more fundamental unseen impacts that remain within Western militaries for the last 15 years. And a lot of those impacts are implications for the culture and the identities and the ethics that we present as organizations. And I think that a number of Western armies that have fought in the global war on terror are finding themselves a little bit eroded by the experience in terms of their ethical foundations. Now, the article comes across a little bit as being an American bashing article. It's not designed to do that. It's just the Americans keep better statistics than everyone else, and therefore it's easier to conduct analysis on them. Funnily enough, the British and the Australians don't keep as much data on the number of moral waivers they issue, for example, to people who don't meet the standards for entry. But the examples are there from the US, and therefore they're sort of worth bringing up. It's pretty clear that over the last 15 years, with the pressures of Iraq and Afghanistan, the Americans certainly, and I would suggest that most armies would follow this trend, have incrementally had to lower their standards for good character entry points into the force, particularly as there were no conscriptions or drafts that took place for the global war on terror. So if you take an example, in the US Marine Corps, there was a 5-fold increase in the granting of what are called moral waivers. Those are waivers against criminal convictions between 1997 and 2007. It went from something like 11% to about 51% of US Marine Corps recruits in the 2007 era. So that impact of no draft, an incremental chip away at those standards of good character for entering, and then fundamentally the experience of combat. What you did is you took this group of these people, of these guys put together, you put them through what was probably a relatively rapid induction and training program, and then you put them through a psychological fire of combat for a longer period of time than we have traditionally done. Even in the First World War, you were generally rotated out of the trenches after 19 days. And we've routinely put people into combat now for up to 12 to 18 months. So that impact on those people is pretty extreme. I think that we suffer from that as an organisation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And if I'm able to understand it, then some of my more astute listeners may be able to get it, but the majority of them probably won't. Now, it isn't all doom and gloom, though. Well, I hope it isn't, because I'm a pretty chirpy kind of person. You also discuss ways to adapt to these challenges. In fact, it's in the section, Adapting to New Challenges, the Role of Military Ethics, and there are 3 ways. Will bringing ethicists closer to strategists fix the problem?
I think they will, and I'll go just back to that previous question just for a second, because I think there's one more point to bring up, because I'll discuss it slightly later. But we talk about that individual problem about the organisation and the cultural foundation of the organisation. But I also would say that we potentially have a problem that institutionally we suffer from a form of almost moral injury from the experiences of Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah. Iraq particularly has a reputation as an unjust conflict due to the lack of a UN Security Council resolution. And I think that idea of sort of an absence of pride and almost a rejection of those realities have kind of come out. I don't know if you've ever seen there's a TV series called Over There, and the fact that Americans called Iraq over there because they didn't even want to talk about it, wasn't allowed to have a face at those sort of times.
It's a series I recommend to anyone who hasn't seen it. Over There's a very interesting look at the Iraq War, and it's not something that you would put in the same sort of genre as Generation Kill. Very, very different in the issues it addresses. Just for our listeners, Tom, are you able to explain what moral injury means? Because not all of them will understand that.
Well, moral injury is a phrase that has developed through military ethicists, but also through psychologists over the last few years. And I'm probably going to get a phone call from Professor Tom Frame, who's very much a leading guy in moral injury over the next couple of days when I get this wrong. But essentially it's talking about I suppose you could call it the look in the mirror injury of some of the experiences you take under combat. I'm a believer that no one who experiences combat comes out of it without some sort of impression left upon them, whether that be an audible reaction to something in the future, whether it be just a consideration of what they did. Moral injury really talks about how spiritually combat can scar people for a very long period of time. And as someone, I felt that was pretty profound, because I always felt that it was my responsibility to try and protect my soldiers from an overt or overly or an unreasonable amount of moral injury for what they were being asked to do when we served overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan. So that, moral injury is quite a spiritual phrase. It speaks to some of the post-traumatic stress disorders that have been gone out, but it also speaks to everyone who experiences combat will suffer some form of moral injury from it, which I think is probably correct.
Yep. That's a very good explanation of it. Now let's go back to these ethicists and strategists getting closer, sitting next to each other and trying to fix this problem. Will it work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said at the start, the article had to dwell on the past for a period of time, but didn't want to dwell in the past, and therefore wanted to look forward. And the article comes across as being pretty critical about our strategic decision making, the way we dealt with Iraq and Afghanistan. It also brings up the fact that, as all good militaries are, the efforts that are being put in now to learn from that experience are pretty extreme, and I think that's pretty common across the US, the Americans, and the Brits and the Canadians. So all Western militaries are seeking to address the issues that we sort here, and they all commonly seem to think that leadership, values, and culture are critical to how we address this. And if you look across what's going on in the organisation at the minute, everyone is reviewing leadership. So the British Army have conducted a leadership review. They have a new Centre for Army Leadership and have just published a new leadership code. The Australian Army is reviewing its leadership doctrine currently and is also considering centres of leadership and the resurgence of the Centre of Defence Leadership and Ethics. And the Americans have appointed a series of 3-star officers looking at culture and looking at addressing culture, and particularly with Marines United, the scandal that's come out over the last few weeks, which might theoretically be reflective of that recruitment standard from 2006, 2007. Now there's no difference. So they're all trying to address this. And they're also, I think, very aware that the sort of failures of Abu Ghraib and some of the strategic decision-making for the last 15 years is strategic failure. You want to look at an example of strategic failure. Abu Ghraib is a fantastic example of where a small group of people, the strategic corporals, so to speak, fundamentally undermined the moral authority of the United States to conduct operations in Iraq. So everyone's aware that that needs to be addressed. So what I try and do in the second half of this article is examine the role that ethical specialists, being academic, being military, being from the clergy, which is a contentious point that some people may want to discuss, but we probably won't here.
We'll stick away from religion, I think.
Yeah, it's probably a good idea. How they might play a role. And we look at that in terms of, or I try and propose it in terms of that alliteration of which you speak, which is a British thing that I can't get away from, of soldiers, squadrons, and strategists. And if it helps, I can talk through each one of those quickly if that would help.
Yeah, that would be good. I think our listeners would enjoy that.
Cool. So the first major area for attention was in the ideas of theoretical education in ethics. Now, we don't really educate very well in ethics. I think staff colleges are the first groups of people that do so, and it's done at some universities, but it's not taught particularly deeply in ab initio training, and it's not particularly taught to soldiers, bar some of the character training that most armies do. And so I sort of argue that by teaching ethics better, what we do is we provide a better conceptual framework for people to consider the very grey and ethical decisions they'll have to take and the dilemmas they might face when they're on operations. So I'm not talking about providing normative advice. What I'm talking about is providing a better understanding of the frameworks that exist so people can discuss, debate, and make good decisions around the rights and wrongs of what they're going to do, remembering that every soldier's day on operations is a day full of ethical dilemmas. It's almost, it's very much part of the nature of war. So I argue what we've got to do is we've got to try and target that in 3 ways. The first thing we've got to do is we've got to drive ethical education lower. So, ethics education sits primarily within some of the training institutions and particularly within the staff colleges and war colleges. Now, my argument is that we need to get ethical academics particularly out of that comfort zone and down into phase 1 and phase 2 training establishments and get them to start learning how to teach soldiers how to understand what ethics is, which is a difficult thing to do, but not an impossible thing to do. The second way to try and address that is to get ethicists and ethics itself involved much greater in collective training. So all armies conduct collective training. That goes right up from the collective training of a squad all the way up to a division or even a corps, depending on the size of the army you've got. And my experience is that we don't really spend enough time trying to engineer true ethical dilemmas into our collective training. And that is situations where commanders have to make decisions where there is no right or wrong answer. Normally, both of the answers are bad, and they have to work out which one of them is right. And it wouldn't be difficult to engineer those, particularly with some advice from experienced ethicists who could provide that advice. And the third area that I think the ethicists really play a role in is in strategy. Now, you and I have discussed strategy on a number of occasions, through the show, through various other bits and pieces. And I think one of the most important things of the last 15 years is this damaging reflection it has on the ability of Western governments to generate effective strategy. And those are strategies as in the use of force. So when I talk about effective strategies, what I'm talking about there is strategies that match well our political goals with our ethical appetites for violence. I suggest that in our current frameworks and the frameworks we've worked on over the last sort of 15 years, we've incrementally drifted towards what you might call a situation of moral absolutism, which is something else I've written on for the strategy bridge, where we genuinely seem to believe that we can and should apply violence on behalf of ourselves, the state, the national interest, and also the global interest through the United Nations. But we seem convinced that we can do that with absolutely no moral cost. And anyone who's ever studied the history of warfare would understand that that is unreasonable and unrealistic. So the final part of this, this piece of advice as to what we need to be doing in the future is that the real challenge in the next 10 years is to try and learn from the global war on terror and find a way of developing a new sort of authentic voice to strategy where we discuss the use of force, the civil relationships that lead to the use of force for political ends. And we do it in a much more authentic and honest way. And I'm studying the Chilcot Inquiry at the minute, which is a pretty hair-raising read. And if there was one thing that is not there, is a level of frank honesty about the realities of war, the realities of the outcomes of war, and national interest and how those things are tied together. And again, I think that ethicists can play a really good part of that. And that could be as deeply as saying, right, well, strategic studies as a field and ethical philosophy as a field need to move closer together. And actually, I think we're seeing a bit of that through some of the advocacy networks that are developed, such as this show, such as the Strategy Bridge, such as others.
Yeah, I mean, we were lucky enough to have a panel show on strategy and ethics, which you're a member of. And that was actually put together through one of those networks, the Strategy Bridge, the online journal. If you don't read it, please do. Tom's actually had a really good article on wargaming pop up there because he is extremely industrious, so he manages to have fingers in every pie, which is great. I liked the idea of you expressing the concept of moral absolutism and how it affects societies when they believe that they can't have a moral cost, or they assume away a moral cost at the implementation of organised and systemic violence for a political need. But what I liked in the paper was that you follow up the previous section, which talks about those three ways of bringing these ethicists into the fold, I suppose, with some challenges. And maybe it's got to do with my background, but I always like having a practical example after a theoretical expression. And it talks about 3 ethical challenges: host nation mentoring, massive coalitions, and autonomous future war. Now, I've enrolled in ethical hacking courses before, and they were actually pretty boring because I'm not the biggest computer geek, although I am a geek. I also think robots are really cool, but I'm not really sure they can be moral. And as a sci-fi fan, they quite often let us down. Can you run us through these 3 ethical challenges and how we can prepare for them?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully, and hopefully we're not getting sort of sick of the sound of my voice now. But
Never.
Never. The 3 challenges, when we sat down and thought about this, moral philosophy is a fairly expansive topic, and I felt at the end of this it was worth trying to focus things down to 3 focal points. And as you said, the first one was host nation mentoring. Now, this is pretty topical. We sit here at the minute with some accusations or some evidence appearing of strikes in Mosul last week from US and coalition airframes that may have killed a number of civilians. What I argue in the paper is that it seems very clear that with our current character of conflict, we will increasingly operate through partners. For one of the reasons, as Rupert Smith says, is that we apply force for what you might call sub-strategic aims. We're not seeking to seize areas of ground. We're seeking to facilitate political outcomes.
Yep.
So it seems very likely that we're going to continue to do this through partner forces. And again, as a reflection of the last 15 years, I think most people would agree that we didn't prepare ourselves particularly well for some of the major ethical challenges that are implicit with working with partner forces. So let's take the strikes in Mosul, for example. Where does the moral and ethical responsibility lie for those strikes? An element of it obviously lies with the pilots who dropped the weapons. An element of it lies with the system that puts them in the place to do so. An element of it lies with the JSACs on the ground who might be directing those fires. And an element of it lies with the Iraqis. And so to what extent where does the ethical buck stop, which I know is a relatively famous phrase? You might look at it as proxy ethics. Mm-hmm. So we discuss working with partners, and we have to look at the proxy ethics. And we've tied ourselves in knots over that a lot over the last 15 years. Anyone who's worked in detention policy will understand quite how many knots can be tied around the release of information to partner forces for detention purposes, for example. Mm-hmm. So those challenges run across the spectrum of war. So if you go right down to the tactical level, you have young soldiers being placed in the position of partnering societies that are very different from their own and have very different conceptions of what is right and wrong. And we've seen that come out viscerally over the last 10 years in some of the green on blue attacks that have taken place across the coalitions, including, as I use in the paper, RSM Daz Chant, who was the Regimental Sergeant Major of the Grenadier Guards, who was killed along with 4 others with a green on blue attack. That seems, from the analysis that went on, to be based around a cultural clash between those soldiers and the Afghans that they were based with. Now, if we had prepared those soldiers better, there's a possibility that wouldn't have happened, or these trends wouldn't have existed. So that's the bottom area. But then it goes right up to the top as well. And again, I don't think we necessarily have thought enough about the rules of engagement dilemmas we were going to place ourselves in working with Afghans and Iraqi partners, or things like detention policy. Now, we have a great capacity to learn from those things now, but only if we agree to learn from it and start to put these frameworks in place to approach it slightly differently. So ethicists, I think, can help across the board with this, both from advising soldiers before they deploy on training, as we've already discussed. Potentially, again, getting them involved, it wouldn't be beyond the pale to see an ethicist working at the ANAOA, the Afghan National Officers Academy, in Kabul, for example. And they can certainly help at the political level of advising of some of the ethical frameworks around rules of engagement, some of the discussions. Military efficacy goes very fast, and sometimes it's not fast enough to think about the ethical long-term outputs or outcomes of what those decisions are made. So that's the first one, is that host nation partnering element. The second one is the idea of, it's kind of linked, but the idea of massive, what I've called modern massive multinational coalitions. And again, I think it's fair to say that a trend of the current character of conflict is for massive coalitions to deal with large problems. Yeah. So if you look at Afghanistan in 2009, there were 52 nations taking part in the Afghan coalition. In 2009, everyone from Singapore to Montenegro, that's the range of societies. And having just had a look at it, there are 68 nations who are currently taking part in the global coalition against ISIS. Mm-hmm. But that also comes with its own ethical challenges. If you go back to just war theory and you go back to the sort of tick box nature of some of the elements of just war theory, you come across proper authority. And in a situation where, for example, a group of nations have come together to deal with a local problem that doesn't require UN Security Council authority to do so, at what stage does a coalition become so large that it doesn't necessarily constitute a proper authority? Mm-hmm. It can't make proper decisions as a group. You end up in a situation where ethics is taking place by negotiation between societies that have very different ethical frameworks and standpoints. And I think some of the outputs can be some quite bad organizational groupthink, and also some ethical creeping where no one is willing to put the buck down and say no, because the rest of the coalition is drifting in a certain direction. Yeah. If you go and look in depth at detention policy, as I bring up again in Afghanistan, for example, you might see some elements of that. And the final one, which is, as you say, is robots and HAL and, Baxter.
Cool. All the cool stuff.
Yeah, the general purpose robot I saw in the Powerhouse Museum last week in Sydney. Impressive. He plays tic-tac-toe against himself.
It's because he's got no friends, because he's got no morals.
Exactly, because no one wants to go near him because he's eventually going to kill everybody.
That's right.
But the question is about the ethics of this automation of warfare. We have seen this explode, I think, over the last 5 to 6 years particularly. A lot of the robots or a lot of the involvement in robotics in warfare at the minute is automated and not autonomous. There is a slight difference, but Google it and you can see it. But Ukraine has been cited as being the first genuine cyber war. Article 5 is now engaged for NATO, if required, on cyber attacks, and they've announced that last year.
Yep.
And we really are in a case where, from last year, the US were very clear that the first vector of their third offset strategy for the future technology of warfare is going to be artificial intelligence, robotics. So this is coming. We're now past that point. But it stands upon the still concern that in 2015, the Future of Life Institute, which is not a military organization nor one tied to any particular organization, wrote an open letter suggesting that inserting artificial intelligence into warfare as the third revolution of warfare after gunpowder and nuclear weapons could theoretically lead to the end of all human life.
Yeah.
That was signed by Elon Musk, Professor Sir Stephen Hawkins, by Noam Chomsky, by Steve Wozniak. 20,000 researchers into this have flagged up the issue that this could be, the control of this is perhaps the greatest ethical challenge of our generation.
And notably, people who are investing, like Elon Musk, he has invested quite heavily in AI development. And this week has been in the news, so has Stephen Hawking reiterating their views as outlined in 2015.
So, it's very much not in their financial interest to do this. I genuinely buy the concerns about this. So, we are, as military people, I am generally a pragmatist in these things, and I look for realistic approaches, and I think that we are facing a situation where the decision has been made that this will happen. We will insert artificial intelligence and automation into warfare to an extent yet to be seen. However, the important bit is that we need to sit down and have a very genuine and very serious ethical discussion about how much we allow to happen almost as a human race, as a species, as you say at the start, try and have a leveraged or leveled conversation. The challenge, obviously, sitting in Australia now and having come from the UK, the challenge for the smaller nations is almost, to bring it back to a bit of classics, is a bit of an ethical Melian dilemma. Excellent. Where we have to decide whether to follow, do what we must and follow the hegemon. So if we find that the US offers to extend the third offset, this technology to other nations, you implicitly buy into the ethical choices that come with that if you choose to accept that support in a challenging world. So I think it's fair to say that the ethical challenges for each nation are different. And we need to try and look at the international standards as to how we control this, and that is being looked at. But I think my overwhelming conclusion is that our estimations of how fast this is coming are highly conservative. I think we're not talking 10, 15 years, we're talking 7 to 10 years that we might see this stuff done.
Yeah, it's not the distant future that it was when we were watching some of the TV shows on science fiction. Star Trek is, we may not be kicking around the galaxy, but we might have that level of technology kicking around the battlefield.
And with all my concerns, I still like a stun gun. But
yeah, that'd be quite handy, just around the office.
Yeah.
Now, Tom, I do like that you're able to tie in the Peloponnesian Wars with robots. There probably hasn't been as quite a broad link across eons or millennia, probably not quite eons. For those that don't know, the Melian dialogue that Tom was referring to is that the strong will do what they will while the weak suffer what they must. It's a very, very good book. Read the Peloponnesian Wars, and particularly the Melian dialogue. You'll get some great sleep. Now, Tom, my final question is one I ask of all guests, usually when I'm sick of them talking. it is not the case. We could talk about ethics for a long time, as long as you keep tying it to robots and cyber war. But this final question relates to the mission on the show. And it's the mission that Big Carl started us off on by writing his book full of trinities, triangles, dialectics, dualisms, and all that sort of stuff. And it's defining war in as many ways as possible so that we can understand and study it from as many angles as possible. And each guest is given a sentence to finish. Now, you've already been on the show once as a panel member and provided an answer. You cannot provide the same answer you did on that show. One, because it was so blatantly Keegan-esque, and I'm not yet sold on Keegan, though I do read his books. But mainly because I need a different definition to keep people interested in the show. So I ask you to finish the sentence. War is.
Okay, Mick. Well, I'm going to give you a dramatic one, which is not about the nature of war necessarily, but it's about the fact that war for me is an uncontrollable entity. And this speaks to ethics as much as it speaks to anything else, that once you let it go, and I buy Clausewitz and the nature of war, once you let war go as an entity, it acts without compunction or moral consideration. It will do what it will. And the way I look at it is that it's almost like a wild animal or a slightly mad attack dog. You can leash it, you can train it, you can seek to have it under control, and you can have the impression that it's under control. But the minute you let that leash off, you never really know what it's going to do. And you never really know when it's going to turn around and bite you back. And so one of my big conclusions of thinking about this for a while is that, we endemically quote Clausewitz in terms of, war is a continuation of politics, depending on the translation, by, through, or with other means. And it's interesting that we now use the phrase by, through, or with when working with partners.
Yeah.
It's an interesting coincidence. But I think that's the wrong phrase. We shouldn't be citing that phrase of Clausewitz as endemically as we do. The one we should cite, and I'll read it verbatim because I think it's important, is slightly further on, and it talks about the fact that the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and commander has to make is to establish by that test the kind of war on which they are embarking, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something that is alien to its nature. Now, sadly, that doesn't quote quite so well because it's a bit longer.
It's not as pithy, is it?
No, but this is, I think,
it's also in book 8, and that would require people to get all the way through the book to actually read it.
But this is where, this is what I think we've got wrong over the last 15 years, is we've sought to use war without engaging or understanding its nature. And we believe that we can unleash it and we can control it. But the reality has been very different. And we've suffered ethically because of that. But anyway, I think that's my final point. That's what I think war is.
An uncontrollable entity. We like it. We'd like to see it on Twitter. We'd like to see people discussing it on Twitter. And also, feel free to jump on your Kindle or even what is known as a book and have a look at Clausewitz's theories on the absolute nature of war, because it is kind of where Tom is harking towards, and that's why he's quoted from book 8 in my understanding, is because you need to understand how you're going to keep that leash on that mad attack dog. Look, Tom, thanks very much for coming on the show. We're going to put a PDF link in the show notes so people can read your very, very good paper. As I've said, follow Tom on Twitter at Helmet Project. Also, get involved in some of the other projects Tom's working on, which are vast and many. He's working on the cove.org.au, which is a Australian Army education platform. He's also involved in the Australian Defence Entrepreneurs Forum branch, as well as the Australian Army's Professional Military Education Association, the Postern Association. And for those listeners who don't know what Postern means, you need to go back and listen to my interview with Peter Dean, just so I can get more downloads. Tom, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Hey, Mick, it's a pleasure. Thanks very much, and have a good evening.
And listeners, the only thing I've got left to say is if you haven't seen the merchandise store, please jump on there, do us a favour and buy my stuff. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.